continue to escalate with North Korea with a pretty tough talk from both sides and a show of force. The Pentagon sending a squad of 8 U.S. fighters and bombers to the farthest point north of the demilitarized zone by any aircraft, American aircraft, this century. They flew in international waters to the east of North Korea. This coming after North Korean's Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho. He delivered a fiery speech at the United Nations yesterday. Ri harshly slamming the president, called him, quote, mentally deranged, and saying Mr. Trump's tough talk on North Korea is making a strike against us, he said, inevitable. Well, President Trump took to Twitter, basically warning that the North will cease to exist if it attacks the U.S. Colorado Republican Senator Cory Gardner, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, also weighed in on this showdown.
We have a long ways to go to continue to ratchet up the economic and diplomatic pressure on North Korea and the enablers of North Korea. Our #1 goal with North Korea, as it relates to North Korea, must and always will be peaceful denuclearization of the North Korean regime.
Is that even possible? Gordon Chang joins us from Washington, author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. First, Gordon, what do you think is going on in Kim Jong-un's head when he reads the president's tweets?
Well, he does feel diminished. But what really concerns me, we've had these threats from North Korea to incinerate American cities for years, and we even have those entertaining videos. But something is new. With Ri Yong-ho's speech at the UN yesterday, he talked about attacking the entire U.S. mainland, but he didn't preface it with what North Koreans have always said in the past. In the past, they've said, look, if the U.S. strikes us, we will strike you. We didn't hear that yesterday from the foreign minister. And so that is a new development. And I think it indicates that there probably is a change in Kim Jong-un's mind as he views all of these developments.
So your interpretation and analysis is that they're thinking of a first strike?
Well, I don't think they're actually thinking of that, but they're talking about that, though. And, the North Koreans parse those words very carefully. Ri Yong-ho was supposed to speak before the UN on Friday. He postponed. Obviously, the North Koreans wanted to think about what his speech would actually specifically say. So I think that you have to assume that they chose their words very carefully. Now, to me, it's incomprehensible that they would think of doing that. But nonetheless, when you look at that speech, you look at the placement of the words, you've got to be very concerned.
He basically called the U.S. the enemy, said the Korean War is continuing, hasn't ended, and they fear an attack by the U.S., and they say the nuclear program is for defensive purposes. Let's listen to a little more of what Ri Yong-ho said at the United Nations.
What else could be a bigger threat than the violent remarks such as pouring fire and fury, total destruction, coming from the top authority of the world's biggest nuclear power? The very reason the DPRK had to possess nuclear weapons is because of the U.S., and it had to strengthen and develop its nuclear force onto the current level to cope with the U.S.
There he's saying it's, our fault.
Yeah, the North Koreans have always said that. They've had a nuclear weapons program since at least 1965, when Kim Il-sung, the founder of the regime, asked for technology from the Chinese. They probably even had a program before that. This has nothing to do with President Trump's words of fire and fury or the rest of it. And we got to remember that when President Trump said that he would totally destroy North Korea, this was his Tuesday UN speech, he preceded it by some very important words. And that was, if the United States is forced to defend itself or its allies. So, President Trump has been careful. Even though he uses bombastic language, he couches it in self-defense.
And
the North Koreans aren't doing this.
That's always been the U.S. policy through other presidents anyway, hasn't it been?
It has been. And matter of fact, if you look at President Trump's words, and fiery as they were, they really were just a restatement of U.S. deterrence policy, which has always talked about massive retaliation if the United States is attacked. So in substance, they weren't anything new. Now, of course, President Trump has used language which is more bellicose, but when you look at the substance, really nothing has changed.
Yeah, something else that I caught in the speech, which I thought was just really a nugget. I mean, he totally rejects Security Council resolutions, rejects the international law and the international legitimacy of the Security Council and the 9 resolutions. Let's listen to what Ri Yong-ho said about that.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a responsible nuclear weapon state. We will take preventative measures by merciless preemptive action in case the U.S. and its vessel forces show any sign of conducting a kind of decapitating operation on our headquarters or military attack against our country.
Finally, he said merciless preemptive action if there's any type of decapitation strike or attack. I mean, what exactly is he talking about?
Well, it's actually even worse than that, Eric, because he talked about a preventative strike. Preemption is recognized that country can preempt another country if an attack is imminent. He talked about preventative, which is not an attack that because something is imminent. It's to prevent your opponent from getting a capability or from doing something. And so this is even more provocative than we first thought when we started to listen to his speech.
Ri Young-ho raising the stakes to a level that we haven't ever practically seen, certainly not since the Korean War back in the early 50s. Gordon Chang, as always, an expert on their behavior and their thinking. Thank you for your analysis this afternoon.
Thanks, Eric.
Of course.